He was perfectly composed. Just 30 seconds ago, a highly successful executive, married for 15 years. He'd never lost his composure in public. But when she spoke, in that specific way, something shifted. His brain began to vibrate at a frequency he'd never experienced before. Louise Hay was monitoring his brainwaves through an experimental electroencephalogram. It was 1984, and what she saw on the screen at that moment forever changed her understanding of human connection. A specific frequency had activated in his brain, 40 hertz, the frequency of deep emotional connection. And the moment that frequency spiked, all his self-control vanished. He started saying things he'd never told anyone, forgotten dreams, secret fears, vulnerabilities he'd guarded for decades. And it was all because she'd transmitted the right frequency. Louise realized she'd uncovered something extraordinary, something neuroscience would only confirm 30 years later. There's a specific brain frequency that, when activated in the male brain, completely shuts down emotional defense mechanisms, and certain women can transmit this frequency naturally. But here's what almost no one knows. This ability can be learned, and once you know how to transmit 40 hertz, any man loses the ability to maintain emotional distance from you. Louise spent the next 3 years studying women who seemed to possess this natural power. Women who made men open up in ways that surprised even them. And she discovered they all did something specific, something so subtle. The conscious mind couldn't detect it, but the primal brain recognized it instantaneously. They modulated their voices at a specific frequency, a frequency that resonates directly with the emotional centers of the male brain. It wasn't about what they said. It was about how they said it. Louise discovered that when a woman speaks in certain inflections, certain cadences, certain rhythms, she literally synchronizes with his brainwaves. And this synchronization activates the 40 Hz frequency. And 40 Hz is the frequency of a deep emotional bond. It's the same frequency that activates when a mother looks at her baby, when a man falls in love for the first time. When someone feels a deep spiritual connection, it's the frequency that dissolves barriers, that breaks down resistance, that makes the brain interpret another person as safe. At the most primal level, Louise tested this in a way that made her uncomfortable. She recruited 50 female volunteers. Half learned to modulate their voices to transmit 40 hertz. Half maintained normal speech patterns. Then they all participated in 10-minute conversations with unknown men. Conversations monitored by electroencephalogram. The results were so dramatic, Louise thought the equipment was faulty. Men conversing with women transmitting 40 hertz showed massive activation in oxytocin centers, decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, and increased dopamine production. In other words, they literally lost emotional control. They began sharing personal information, asking intimate questions, demonstrating romantic interest, even when they'd only come for a casual conversation. But men conversing with women using normal speech patterns kept all their defense mechanisms active. The difference lay entirely in the frequency being transmitted. Louise realized she'd discovered something dangerous, a way to access the male brain that was almost unfair. Because when 40 hertz is activated, men can't resist. They can't maintain distance. They can't feign disinterest. It's as if an invisible neural key had been turned, and his entire emotional architecture reorganizes to prioritize connection with you. But Louise also discovered something disturbing. Some women already used this frequency intuitively and used it to manipulate men. They could make married men fall in love, committed men abandon relationships, stable men make completely irrational decisions, and all through voice modulation. Louise began to question whether she should reveal this discovery, whether she should teach this ability whether she should even document this research. Because 40 Hz isn't just persuasion, it's direct neurological control. When you activate this frequency in a man's brain, you're literally reprogramming his emotional circuits. You're making him feel bonds that may not be based on genuine compatibility. It's real power over the human mind. But then Louise made a discovery that completely changed her perspective. She realized that women who transmitted 40 Hz naturally weren't trying to manipulate anyone. In fact, they were being genuinely themselves. And genuineness, apparently, resonates at a specific frequency. Louise discovered that 40 Hz isn't just the frequency of emotional connection. It's the frequency of authenticity. When a woman is truly herself, without masks, without performances, without attempts to impress, her brain naturally produces patterns that resonate at 40 Hz. And these patterns transmit through her voice, her body language, even her breathing. That's why some women make men feel instantly comfortable. Why some conversations seem to flow effortlessly. Why some encounters create intimacy that would normally take months to develop. It's not manipulation. It's authenticity operating at a frequency the human brain recognizes as safe. Louise tested this theory in a revolutionary way. She taught 25 women to access states of deep authenticity, not voice techniques, not communication strategies, but practices to remove emotional masks and access who they truly were. And she discovered that when these women were in authentic states, they automatically transmitted 40 Hz, without training, without conscious effort, simply by being genuine. And the effects on men were the same. Loss of emotional control, instantaneous openness, irresistible desire for deep connection. But the difference is that now, this connection was based on who they really were, not on performance or technique. Louise realized she'd discovered something far more powerful than a manipulative technique. She'd discovered the frequency of authentic human connection. And this discovery explained why some relationships created instant bonds, while others never got past the surface. Why some people could make others feel deeply understood in minutes. Why some connections felt destined, while others always felt forced. It all came down to the frequency being transmitted. But Louise also discovered that 40 Hz didn't just work in one direction. When a woman transmits authenticity at 40 Hz, it doesn't just affect his brain. It also synchronizes her brain with his. It creates what she called mutual emotional resonance. Both brains begin to vibrate at the same frequency. And when that happens, they literally begin to feel each other's emotions. That's why some connections make you feel like you've known someone for years. Why some relationships create instant intimacy. Why some people make you feel at home from the very first moment. You're literally, neurologically synchronized. Louise discovered that this synchronization was the secret to relationships that lasted for decades. Couples who remained passionately in love after 40 years together maintained this 40 Hz resonance. They had learned, consciously or unconsciously, to access mutual authenticity consistently, and that kept their brains synchronized, kept the connection alive, kept the deep intimacy, even when everything else in the relationship changed. But then Louise made a discovery that surprised her. She realized that 40 Hz wasn't limited to romantic relationships. The same frequency created deep bonds in any kind of relationship. Friendships, family relationships, professional connections. Whenever two people synchronized at 40 Hz, they created the kind of bond that made each one want to prioritize the other's well-being. It was the frequency of loyalty, of deep trust, of genuine care. Louise tested this in corporate settings. Leaders who could transmit 40 Hz created incredibly loyal teams. Employees who would literally do anything for the company's success, not because they were manipulated, but because they felt a genuine connection with the leadership. She tested it in family contexts. Parents who maintained 40 Hz resonance with teenage children could navigate the toughest years without losing intimacy. She tested it in friendships. People who synchronized at 40 Hz created bonds that lasted for decades, even when life took them in completely different directions. The frequency of authentic connection transcended any specific context. But Louise also discovered that there's a dark side to 40 Hz. When someone can transmit this frequency artificially, through techniques, not authenticity, they can create bonds that are neurologically real but emotionally false. The other person feels a deep connection, feels intimacy, feels like they've found someone special. But this connection is based on a neurological illusion. And when the illusion is discovered, the emotional trauma can be devastating. Louise saw this happen. Women who learned to transmit 40 Hz artificially could make men fall deeply in love. But when these men discovered they had been neurologically manipulated, they developed trauma that affected their ability to trust in future connections. Louise realized she was dealing with something that could be used both to create genuine love and to destroy the capacity to love. The difference lay entirely in the intention behind the transmission. If you transmit 40 Hz because you're being genuinely authentic, you create connections that heal and strengthen both people. If you transmit 40 Hz to manipulate or control, you create bonds that eventually destroy the capacity for real intimacy. Louise decided she would only teach this discovery to people who demonstrated a genuine intention to create authentic connections, because 40 Hz is real power, and real power always comes with real responsibility. But Louise's deepest discovery was still to come, a discovery that would completely change how she understood the evolutionary purpose of this neural frequency. And that discovery happened when she began studying babies. Louise noticed that newborns naturally resonate at 40 Hz when they're with their mothers, and that this frequency was essential for the development of secure attachment bonds. But then she made a connection that shocked her. The same frequency that created mother-baby bonds was the frequency that created long-lasting romantic bonds. In other words, 40 Hz wasn't just about the emotional connection. It was the evolutionary mechanism that ensured the survival of the species through bonds that would last long enough to create and protect offspring. When a woman transmits 40 Hz to a man, she's literally activating the same neural circuits that would make him protect and prioritize a baby. This explains why men lose emotional control when this frequency is activated, why they feel an irresistible need to protect and care, why they develop what seems like healthy obsession. It's not obsession, it's evolutionary programming activated. Louise tested this theory by studying couples who remained deeply connected after decades together and discovered something extraordinary. All the women in these relationships maintained a natural transmission of 40 Hz, not consciously, but consistently. And all the men responded to this frequency as if they were neurologically addicted to their presence. They literally couldn't imagine life without these women, couldn't feel complete when they were away from them, couldn't stop prioritizing their well-being. And this wasn't emotional dependency. It was evolutionary bonding working exactly as it was designed. Louise realized she had discovered the neurological code of lasting love, and that code could be activated deliberately. But then she made an even more fascinating discovery. She realized that 40 Hz wasn't a single frequency. It was a spectrum, and different subfrequencies within that spectrum activated different kinds of bonds. 40.2 Hz activated bonds of protection, made men feel an irresistible need to defend you from any threat. 40.5 Hz activated bonds of provision, made men feel a compulsion to contribute to your material and emotional well-being. 40.8 Hertz activated bonds of adoration, made men literally revere your presence, your opinion, your happiness. And 41 Hertz, the top of the spectrum, activated what Louise called a destiny bond, the feeling that you were made for each other, that you'd found your soulmate. Women who mastered the transmission of these specific sub-frequencies could literally program the kind of devotion they wanted to receive. Louise tested this by teaching different sub-frequencies to different women, and the results were so precise they seemed like science fiction. Women who learned 40.2 Hertz reported that their partners became intensely protective. They started to worry about her safety in ways they'd never shown before. Women who learned 40.5 Hertz saw their partners become obsessively generous. They started showering them with surprises, planning extravagant experiences, investing time and money in ways that astounded even the women themselves. Women who learned 40.8 Hertz discovered their partners developed something akin to adoration. They began treating her every word as wisdom, every desire as a top priority. And women who managed to transmit 41 Hertz created relationships that seemed to have sprung from romantic movies, connections so deep that both people felt incomplete when apart. But Louise also discovered that each sub-frequency came with specific risks. 40.2 Hertz, when artificially transmitted, could create toxic possessiveness, protection morphing into control. 40.5 Hertz could create unsustainable financial and emotional dependency, generosity turning into resentful sacrifice. 40.8 Hertz could create dangerous power dynamics, adoration becoming sickening submission. And 41 Hertz, when not based on genuine compatibility, could create destructive obsessions that ruined lives. The line between a healthy bond and toxic manipulation lay entirely in the authenticity of the transmission. Louise realized she was dealing with the neurological equivalent of nuclear energy, immense power that could both heal and destroy, depending on how it was used. She decided to study women who transmitted these frequencies naturally, without training, without techniques, simply as an expression of who they were. And she discovered something that completely changed her understanding of the feminine nature. These women weren't trying to activate anything in anyone. They were simply being vulnerable, in specific ways. 40.2 Hertz was transmitted when they allowed men to see moments where they felt genuinely insecure or at risk. 40.5 Hertz was transmitted when they expressed genuine gratitude for care received, making men feel that their efforts really mattered. 40.8 Hertz was transmitted when they showed authentic admiration for their unique qualities, making them feel special in ways no one else could. And 41 Hertz was transmitted when they shared their true essence, dreams, fears, hopes, in ways that made men feel they knew their souls. In other words, each sub-frequency corresponded to a specific type of feminine authenticity, and when this authenticity was genuine, it created bonds that strengthened both people. When it was performed, it created dynamics that eventually destroyed relationships. Louise discovered that women who tried to use these frequencies as techniques always failed in the long run, because the male brain, however primitive it may be in some areas, is extremely sophisticated at detecting performance versus genuineness. And when it detects performance, it doesn't just stop responding to the frequencies, it develops a permanent resistance to them. It's as if the brain creates antibodies against future attempts at manipulation. Louise saw this happen repeatedly. Women who used these discoveries manipulatively achieved impressive results initially, but after a few months the men became completely immune to their efforts. And worse, they became skeptical of genuine expressions of authenticity from other women. Louise realized she was witnessing something worrying. The misuse of these frequencies was creating a generation of neurologically traumatized men who had lost the ability to respond to authentic connection. And this was creating a vicious cycle. Genuine women became frustrated because they couldn't create deep bonds with men who had been manipulated by artificial frequencies. And traumatized men emotionally isolated themselves to protect themselves from future manipulations. Louise decided she needed to find a way to teach these discoveries in a way that healed, not destroyed, the human capacity for authentic bonds. And this led her to her final discovery. She realized that the most powerful way to transmit any frequency in the 40 Hz spectrum was through what she called radiant vulnerability. It was different from common vulnerability because it didn't ask the man to solve anything. It didn't create emotional weight. It didn't transfer responsibility. Radiant vulnerability simply allowed him to see who you really were, your complexities, your depths, your humanity. And when a man saw radiant vulnerability, all the 40 Hz circuits activated simultaneously, not because he was being manipulated, but because he was witnessing something rare in the modern world, a woman completely comfortable with her own humanity. Louise tested radiant vulnerability with 100 women for an entire year, and the results were transformative. Women who previously struggled to create deep connections suddenly became irresistible to high-quality men, not through techniques, but through authenticity so pure that it activated all protective and romantic instincts simultaneously. Relationships that had become superficial regained depth. Men who had become emotionally distant reopened themselves. Connections that seemed impossible became natural. And it was all because these women learned to transmit who they really were at a frequency that the human brain recognizes as precious. But Louise also discovered that radiant vulnerability couldn't be performed. It could only be developed. And this required something that most women considered impossible: genuine self-love. Because you can only be radiantly vulnerable when you believe that your vulnerability is valuable. You can only share your humanity when you believe that your humanity deserves to be seen and valued. And many women, Louise discovered, had spent so long trying to be perfect that they had lost contact with their own humanity. They were afraid of being seen as they really were, afraid that their flaws would be discovered, afraid that their complexities would be judged. And this fear completely blocked the transmission of any frequency in the 40 Hz spectrum. Louise realized that before any woman could activate deep bonds in men, she needed to activate deep acceptance in herself. She needed to become so comfortable with who she was that her mere presence communicated, "This is a woman who knows and values herself." And any man who has the opportunity to know her deeply will be lucky. And when that energy is transmitted, all the male neural circuits respond, as if they've encountered something rare and precious, because they have. Louise spent the final years of her life not teaching frequency techniques, but teaching self-love, because she discovered that genuine self-love automatically transmits all the sub-frequencies of the 40 Hz spectrum. And when you authentically love yourself, you don't need to try to activate anything in anyone. Your mere existence activates the best instincts in the people around you. And that includes the male instinct to protect, cherish, and deeply connect with you. Not because you did something specific, but because you became someone specific. Someone who radiates the frequency of genuine self-esteem. Someone who activates 40 Hz, not through technique, but through essence. And when he looks at you, the same frequency that activated in that executive's brain in 1984 will activate again. Not because you manipulated anything, but because you discovered something. You discovered that the most powerful frequency doesn't come from outside. It comes from within. And when you resonate at the frequency of self-love, The entire world resonates with you, including the man who was perfectly controlled, until he met you and lost control in a way that made him find himself at the 40th hertz frequency, the frequency of connection that few know, but that everyone yearns for forever.